faithfully sharing value and breaking down great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today I'm interpreting the book The Undoing Project. Every day we make big and small decisions. For breakfast, should I have coffee or tea? In the evening, do I go out with friends or stay in watching basketball? Should I invest in a fund? Should I marry my current partner? Faced with several treatment options from the doctor, how should I choose? With the pandemic spreading, should stricter control measures be implemented? When decisions are tough, we often seek expert advice or look for statistical data and typical cases. But does this really reduce the risk? Are experts really trustworthy? Does data really have predictive power? Israeli psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky noticed this issue back in the 1960s. They found that both experts and ordinary people make mistakes in specific situations. Why does the human brain make illogical errors when facing an uncertain future? These two psychologists ventured into economists' territory to study human decision-making behavior. Their prospect theory earned Kahneman the 2002 Nobel Prize in economics. In 2011, Kahneman published Thinking Fast and Slow, centered on prospect theory, which became a classic in behavioral economics. The Undoing Project tells the story of how these two psychologists who started as strangers joined forces in decision research and the significant impact of prospect theory across academic and practical fields. The author, Michael Lewis, is a super best-selling author. His representative work, Liar's Poker, is a classic depicting Wall Street culture in the 1980s, ranked by Forbes as one of the 20 most influential business books of the 20th century. The book we're discussing today, The Undoing Project, also follows Lewis's signature writing style. With 12 chapters and 280,000 words, it vividly portrays Kahneman and Tversky's academic ideas and life stories through multiple perspectives, also showcasing the birth of behavioral economics and its potential and impact. Next, we'll interpret this book through 3 parts. First, how did Kahneman and Tversky meet and start collaborating? Second, what is the prospect theory they proposed? Third, how has prospect theory impacted our lives? Part 1. How did Kahneman and Tversky meet and start collaborating? Daniel Kahneman was born in 1934 into a Jewish family in Tel Aviv, Israel. Later, moving with his parents to Paris, France during World War II to evade Nazi persecution, Kahneman and his family had to conceal their identity and flee constantly. He learned to keep a low profile at school, always wary of others' gazes, to avoid exposing his Jewish identity. This complex experience made him accustomed to isolating himself from crowds while honing his keen observation skills and a suspicious, sensitive heart. After World War II ended, 14-year-old Kahneman returned to Jerusalem with his mother. By high school, he was already convinced he would become a psychologist, and because he wanted to study people. He said, "My interest in psychology was actually a path to philosophy. To understand the world, I tried to study why people, especially myself, see the world this way." Most Israelis serve 3 years in the military after high school, but Kahneman entered Hebrew University directly at 17 due to outstanding grades, majoring in psychology. With limited faculty quality, Kahneman spent 3 years essentially self-teaching to complete his studies. Among popular psychological schools then, Freud's psychoanalysis focused heavily on childhood experiences, while behaviorism seemed obsessed with making lab rats avoid dangers and navigate mazes. Kahneman had little interest in revisiting his childhood or lab rodents. What captivated him most was Gestalt psychology. This school dedicated itself to scientifically exploring human cognition, how the mind constructs meaning, influences environmental perception, and how environment shapes judgment. Why did some Jews recognize reality and flee when Hitler dominated Europe, while others stayed until extermination? These questions deeply fascinated Kahneman. At 20, fresh from university, Kahneman joined the military. Israel, newly founded, urgently needed to enhance soldiers' combat effectiveness, but struggled to find experienced professionals. Shortly after earning his psychology degree, Kahneman was entrusted with the important task of soldier selection. The military believed each branch had unique characteristics, and soldiers' personalities differed accordingly. If these could be properly matched, the Army's combat effectiveness would significantly improve. To solve this, Kahneman developed a personality test scale, which required multiple rounds of testing and refinement to become rigorous and effective. But the toughest challenge was ensuring interviewers made accurate assessments during routine interviews, which proved extremely difficult. As early as 1915, American psychologist Edward Thorndike proposed the halo effect. It means if we like one aspect of something or someone, we unconsciously assume their other qualities are excellent too, similar to love me, love my dog. For example, we tend to think quick-witted people are naturally strong leaders, though these traits aren't actually connected. In military interviews, soldiers' appearance and demeanor strongly triggered interviewers' emotions and biases. Assessments made with such thinking were inevitably unreliable. To reduce the halo effect's impact, Kahneman required interviewers to document soldiers' specific behaviors rather than subjective judgments. He took the scale for field testing in the military, with disappointing results. Outstanding infantry and tank soldiers showed no significant personality differences. Where are the outstanding people? They're all outstanding. However, this scale could predict a soldier's likelihood of becoming combat elite, making Kahneman's test the military selection gold standard still used today, and revealing an important truth to Kahneman. Human judgment is fallible. We must find ways to eliminate subjective intuition's interference. After this, Kahneman pursued advanced studies at UC Berkeley, returning to Hebrew University as a teaching assistant after graduation. He conducted various studies in psychology. He analyzed children's willingness to integrate into groups and examined how soldiers' attention allocation affected combat skills. But he ultimately entered decision-making research because he met Tversky.
Tversky, born in Israel in 1937, had a personality diametrically opposed to Kahneman's. Energetic, he'd received the Israeli military's highest bravery medal.
He was exceptionally intelligent, witty, and didn't hold back when satirizing others. People loved chatting with him and sought his approval. Tversky excelled at grasping the core of problems, able to keenly spot flaws in existing theoretical frameworks and propose his own insights. During university, Tversky wavered between philosophy and various psychology branches, as no field seemed compelling enough for his full commitment.
Until he stumbled upon a paper whose author urged psychologists to examine irrational behaviors in economics. By definition, psychology and economics research overlap. Psychology studies human psychology and behavior.
Psychologists constantly seek which behaviors most directly reflect mental processes, while economists study human behavior, using money as a metric to examine how people make optimal decisions in various situations.
One of economics' fundamental assumptions is that humans are rational.
For example, if someone prefers tea over hot chocolate and coffee over tea, then between coffee and hot chocolate, they'd certainly choose coffee. But in daily life, do we really make every choice completely rationally?
Actual research found nearly a quarter of people chose hot chocolate.
Why did these people make irrational choices? Most economists ignored these anomalies, but psychologists like Tversky saw their value. In fall 1961, Tversky left Jerusalem for the University of Michigan to further study how humans make decisions. Tversky proposed that when facing multiple options, people don't simply rank them and choose the top one. When deciding, we have an internal ideal prototype with multiple characteristics. Real-world options each have their own features. Sometimes we focus more on similarities between the ideal and options, other times on differences. This depends entirely on the decision context. For example, if someone's ideal drink is a hot latte with cream, caramel sauce, and nuts, their prototype has high caffeine, high sugar, crunchy texture, etc. At the start of the comparison, this person focused more on caffeine content. So between hot chocolate and tea, they chose tea, and then between tea and coffee, chose coffee. But when hot chocolate and coffee were placed together, the sugar content factor suddenly became active, making them switch to hot chocolate. Tversky's theory reveals how our brains store concepts and features of objects and make comparisons. It also explains why people make those irrational decisions. Like Kahneman, Tversky noticed how context affects decision-making, but their paths didn't cross until 1969. That year, Kahneman was 35 and Tversky 32, both teaching at Hebrew University. Kahneman invited Tversky to give a small lecture to his students. In the lecture, Tversky briefly explained an economic theory. When judging probability, our intuition gives answers close to correct. Suppose you have two bags, one with 75 red balls and 15 white, the other with 75 white and 15 red. You pick a bag and draw balls one by one. If you draw 3 red balls in a row, what's the chance it's the red heavy bag?
The bag with more red balls?
Most people feel about 70% sure it's the red heavy bag. Actually, the probability is over 96%. Seems our judgment is fairly accurate, right? But Kahneman thought this was absurd. Just pulling a few balls and guessing a number proves humans have excellent rational intuition. Oh, our vision and hearing can be influenced by environment, and our thinking often makes mistakes. We might give high interview scores just because we like someone's eye color. Kahneman's rebuttal caught Tversky off guard and made him question economists' confident decision theories. Afterward, Kahneman told his wife he'd out-argued a rebellious young colleague. Meanwhile, Tversky, rarely bested in debate, felt like he'd experienced an internal earthquake. That lecture sparked their collaboration. That same year, they began joint research on judgment and decision-making. They established a research routine. Kahneman collected foolish mistakes, his own or others. Then they'd hole up in the lab all day, analyzing, debating hypotheses, finally designing ambiguous options for students to judge probabilities or choose preferences. Sometimes they even recruited statistics professors for experiments. If even experts violated statistical principles, decision irrationality wasn't momentary lapse but universal human bias. To outsiders, these two seemed utterly incompatible. Kahneman the pessimist, Tversky the optimist. Kahneman avoiding parties, Tversky the life of them. Kahneman's chaotic office versus Tversky's minimalist space. Yet in research, they synced perfectly. Long hours sparking ideas through debate and listening. Kahneman felt unprecedented confidence. Tversky dropped his trademark sharpness. Laughter often echoed outside their seminar room. In 1970, when Tversky briefly worked in the U.S., their long-distance collaboration intensified, each gathering experimental data. Though U.S. researchers tried joining, when Kahneman arrived with data, everyone saw no space existed between these two. Their minds fused, typing side by side, co-writing papers until authorship blurred. This decade-long partnership birthed groundbreaking prospect theory. So what exactly is prospect theory? How did they develop it?
Next, in part 2, we'll explore how Kahneman and Tversky first identified judgment-influencing factors.
They proposed 3 key heuristics: representativeness, availability, and anchoring and adjustment. The first heuristic, representativeness, means we form prototypes or ideals of things in our minds based on past experiences. When making judgments, we compare alternatives to these ideals. For example, what characteristics do you think make an excellent male basketball player? What? Many might picture explosive black athletes, tall, muscular, with strong defensive skills. That's our mental prototype. That's why Pau Gasol and Jeremy Lin were underestimated during drafts. Gasol was considered heavy-set in his youth, while Lin's Asian features raised doubts about his speed and explosiveness. These candidates didn't match the ideal prototype, so they were initially overlooked. Yet they've since proven how mistaken those teams were. to pass on them. The second judgment influencing heuristic, availability heuristic. When judging likelihood, we scan memories for similar past events. If examples come easily to mind, we assume the event is frequent or likely to recur. And after a nuclear plant accident, people fear other plants will have accidents. Or if someone knows couples who divorced after living with in-laws for years, they'll likely predict high divorce odds for similar couples. The third judgment heuristic, anchoring and adjustment. Anchoring, as in a ship's anchor, this means when estimating values or probabilities, we first set a mental starting point, like dropping anchor, then adjust slightly from there. Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated this. Subjects spun a wheel for random numbers, 1 through 99, then guessed African nations, those with higher starting numbers, guessed higher. This shows even arbitrary anchors unconsciously sway our judgments. As research deepened, after clarifying judgment influencers, Kahneman and Tversky explored decision-making. How does it differ from judgment? Kahneman had a personal experience that perfectly illustrates this. In 1974, during the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli officials sought advice from Kahneman and experts on whether to accept U.S. Secretary Kissinger's mediation. They concluded Kissinger's involvement increased peaceful resolution chances by 10%, recommending his help. Officials dismissed this, saying, "Only 10%? That's insignificant." Astonishing Kahneman and Tversky. Experts provided rational judgment, yet it didn't lead to rational government decisions. Facing uncertain futures, what causes our irrational decisions? Economists then favored von Neumann and Morgenstern's expected utility theory for decisions under uncertainty. This theory mathematically guides rational decisions by calculating utility in uncertain situations. Say you choose 90,000 cash now or a 50% chance lottery ticket for 200,000, what would you pick? Expected utility theory says cash utility is 90,000 yen. Lottery utility is 200,000 times 50% equals 100,000 yen. So rationally, you should choose the higher yield lottery ticket. Mathematically, as winning probability rises, expected utility should increase linearly. But Kahneman and Tversky studied real decisions, not math models. In actual surveys, more people chose the cash over the higher expected value lottery. Is this risk aversion? Or because we anticipate regretting missing 90,000 if the lottery loses? And Kahneman and Tversky designed experiments to identify decision influencers. Mid-process, Tversky proposed flipping conditions. What if people faced losses instead of gains? They immediately devised an experiment. Suppose you've lost 500 yen in a bet. You can leave accepting the loss, or bet again with 50% chance of losing 1,000 yen total, or 50% chance losing nothing. And what would you choose? They found most chose to bet again, though expected loss calculations showed both options at 500 yen. Yet people preferred risking it. Completely opposite to the cash versus lottery decision. This unprecedented discovery led Kahneman and Tversky to conclude humans are risk-averse toward gains. That's why we prefer immediate cash over future lottery winnings. This is risk aversion. But when facing losses, humans actively seek risk. Hence why we chase losses at gambling tables. This is called risk-seeking behavior. Kahneman and Tversky adjusted experiments multiple times, varying probabilities and amounts of gains or losses. They also discovered we're irrational about tiny probabilities. At extremely low odds like 1 in 100,000, preferences shift. People overvalue minute chances of gain. That's why many buy lottery tickets or retweet giveaways despite low odds. Conversely, people overfear microscopic loss risks, hence buying high premium insurance. In 1979, Kahneman and Tversky synthesized years of research, formally publishing prospect theory. The theory states decisions depend on whether outcomes feel like gains or losses. Gains carry positive psychological value, losses negative value. As amounts increase, our psychological sensitivity diminishes, but we always feel losses more acutely. Unlike expected utility theory, prospect theory emphasizes psychological value, not mathematical utility, drives decisions. Facing guaranteed gains, we become conservative. Facing certain losses, we become risk-seeking. Facing certain losses, we become risk-seeking. But if a decision could bring gains or losses, our heightened sensitivity to losses often leads to inaction. After understanding decision preferences in gain or loss scenarios, have you considered manipulating choices by changing situational descriptions? To test this, Kahneman and Tversky created the famous Asian disease problem. Imagine an Asian disease outbreak threatening 600 lives. Choose between treatment A saves 200 people. Treatment B has 33% chance of saving all, 67% chance of saving none. Which would you choose? Most chose A but reframed. Treatment A causes 400 deaths. Treatment B, 33% chance nobody dies, 67% chance all die. Which now? Most chose B. Saving 200 people equals 400 deaths. We overlook that gains or losses are two sides of the same coin. This experiment confirmed our decisions are swayed by how situations are described. They named this the framing effect or isolation effect. In part two, we saw judgment influenced by representativeness, availability, and anchoring heuristics. Decisions are shaped by framing, risk-averse with gains, risk-seeking with losses. Prospect theory, rooted in real decision-making, profoundly impacted society for decades. In part three, we explore prospect theory's influence. Kahneman and Tversky's work emerged from documenting real decisions. Unlike economists' mathematical models, it reflects the real world like a mirror. Driven by these researchers, prospect theory has transformed our lives. For example, seeing car fuel consumption now universally measured as liters per kilometer stems directly from their theory. Previously in the US, miles per gallon was the standard metric. In 2008, psychologists Richard Lyric and Jack Saul argued in Science magazine that this phrasing misleads fuel efficiency judgments. Consider this example. Adam's old car got 12 miles per gallon. His new one gets 14. Beth's old car got 30 miles per gallon. Her new one gets 40. With similar annual mileage, surely Beth saves more fuel after upgrading right. Adam gains 2 miles per gallon, while Beth gains 10 miles per gallon. But calculating for 10,000 miles, Adam saves 119 gallons, Beth only 83. Miles per gallon is a misleading frame. It doesn't help choose fuel-efficient cars. Since 2013, U.S. car labels switched to gallons per 100 miles. In China now, we also use liters per 100 kilometers to evaluate fuel efficiency. In 2009, law professor Cass Sunstein joined the White House to evaluate U.S. social policies. He incorporated Kahneman and Tversky's findings, smoothing policy implementation. For instance, when getting a driver's license, you complete an organ donation form. If default is non-donor, would you actively opt in? If default is donor, would you opt out? Many haven't deeply considered donation, but stick with defaults to avoid weighing gains or losses or social deviance. So as policymakers, how should you design forms to increase donation rates? The default option becomes obvious. Altering defaults changes the decision framework, applying the framing effect. The U.S. government has promoted retirement plans, originally requiring employees to opt in actively, but switching to default enrollment increased participation by 30%. A tiny preset option propelled policy implementation. Yet their academic achievements flourished. Conversely, Kahneman and Tversky's partnership became increasingly strained. Around 1977, both moved to America, and everything changed. Americans revered Tversky more, awarding him the MacArthur Genius Grant without mentioning collaborator Kahneman. This plunged the sensitive, self-doubting Kahneman into emotional turmoil. Tversky grew furious, fearing the award would destroy their collaboration. Distance between universities prevented their former idea exchanges, stalling research. Facing economist opposition, Tversky, combative by nature, retaliated with harshly worded papers, unsettling the conflict-averse Kahneman. Kahneman grew deeply uncomfortable.
Their partnership teetered on collapse amid agonizing indecision.
Years later, Kahneman severed their friendship. But just 3 days later, Tversky called Kahneman. He had cancer and 6 months to live. Tversky's message. We'll always be friends, melted Kahneman's defenses, briefly restoring their trust. Tversky admitted Kahneman caused him the most pain, yet remained his final confidant. Tversky died in 1996. In 2002, Kahneman accepted their shared Nobel Prize. Their collaboration mirrored ancient soulmates, Kahneman with keen observational skepticism, Tversky with razor-sharp problem dissection, embodying Gestalt psychology's essence.
The whole exceeds the sum of its parts. Together, they birthed prospect theory, illuminating real human behavior.
After Tversky's departure, Kahneman deepened his focus on psychology. In 2011, he integrated psychologists Stanovich and Evans' fast or slow systems with his lifelong research, publishing Thinking, Fast, and Slow. The book presents key behavioral decision findings while showcasing his recent happiness research. Economists assumed people decide based on utility, the foundation of many economic theorems. But Kahneman discovered our evaluation of experiences depends on their peak and end. The peak-end rule. If we could engineer happy experiences to accumulate more lifetime happiness, would we still prioritize money or time utility and decisions? That concludes our interpretation of the Undoing Project. Find show notes below. See you next time.